The tablet weighs less than you'd expect. Catalogue number K162, held in climate-controlled storage beneath the British Museum at exactly 18 degrees Celsius, fits inside 2 cupped palms. The clay is pale, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into its surface around 1750 BCE are still sharp enough to cast small shadows under direct light. 7 columns. A procedural text describing 7 gates, a 3-day death, and a return that carries conditions. Scholars classify it as mythology. But the scribes who pressed these marks worked in the same offices where grain receipts and tax records were kept. They used the same notation, the same careful hand. What they chose to record alongside the harvest totals has not been fully explained. The civilization that produced this tablet, the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia, left behind approximately 500,000 clay objects. Most are administrative, but scattered among the inventory counts and land surveys are texts that describe something else entirely, what they appear to have understood as the structure of existence itself, a cycle, a descent, a return. Tonight we'll move through 3 layers of what these ancient Sumerian texts record: the architecture of their underworld, the pattern of death and return woven into their oldest narratives, and the persistent question of whether the cycle they documented was meant as story or as something closer to a map. We don't need to settle that question tonight. We only need to follow what the clay says. The landscape the Sumerians inhabited, a flat alluvial plain between 2 rivers in what is now southern Iraq, was not a terrain that encouraged illusions of permanence. The ground itself held memory. When builders dug foundations for new temples, they uncovered older temples beneath. When scribes excavated archives, they encountered tablets written in languages they could barely decipher, evidence that someone before them had also written things down, had also tried to preserve what they knew against the certainty of loss. They lived quite literally on top of previous cycles. Their written record reflects this awareness. The Sumerian King List, preserved most completely on a prism-shaped object designated WB444, currently held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, opens with a statement that has puzzled historians for over a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not emerged, not developed, descended, as if governance itself arrived fully formed from somewhere else, handed down to a world already waiting for it. What follows is a chronicle of rulers whose reigns extend across spans of time that resist any conventional reading. The first king listed, Alulim of Eridu, is recorded as having ruled for 28,800 years, his successor Alulgar for 36,000. 8 cities and their rulers are documented before the text arrives at a single line that resets everything. Then the flood swept over. After that line, the reign lengths begin to shorten, measurably, systematically. By the time the list reaches rulers whose existence archaeology can confirm, kings whose palaces have been excavated, whose administrative records survive in parallel sources, the numbers have descended into ranges we recognize. 5 years, 8 years, 23. Whether those earlier numbers encode something literal, reflect a different system of counting, or represent a culture's way of expressing that something once operated under different conditions, the text offers no explanation. It simply records the progression, and some researchers have noted that the progression is not random. It follows a consistent decline iteration by iteration, as if documenting a parameter that was gradually changing rather than figures that were gradually being invented. This pattern descent transformation, diminishment continuation surfaces across Sumerian literature with a consistency that may be worth examining slowly. In the descent narratives of the goddess Inanna, a journey through 7 sequential gates strips her of every attribute of her divine identity. Before she arrives at the underworld throne room, dead hung on a hook for exactly 3 days and 3 nights. Not approximately 3 days, the text counts before a reversal becomes possible. In the laments for the shepherd god Dumuzi, a cycle of death and return repeats annually, not as commemoration of a past event, but as what the ritual calendar treats as the present occurrence of an ongoing mechanism. In the flood accounts, the Eridu Genesis as the Atrahasis epic, the version embedded in the epic of Gilgamesh's civilization, is not obliterated, but reset its essential pattern, lifted, preserved, and reintroduced at a reduced scale each time, carrying forward fragments of what came before while losing others that cannot be recovered. The scribes who copied these texts were the same people who calculated planetary positions, predicted eclipses, and tracked the helical rising of Venus across decades of observation. They applied identical notational systems to grain inventories, astronomical tables, and descent narratives. They do not appear to have distinguished sharply between categories we now separate as science and sacred literature. To them, the movement of stars and the movement of souls through underworld gates may have belonged to the same body of documented pattern. Whether that equivalence reveals something true about the nature of existence or reflects the limits of a world that had not yet separated observation from interpretation, that is not a question we can resolve tonight. But it is one worth holding gently in the quiet as we begin. So we follow the first tracer clay tablet and number pressed into its surface that doesn't fit our understanding of time, and a civilization that treated the pattern it documented with the same care it brought to the stars. The Prism and the Descending Kingdom. In the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, in a room where the lighting is kept deliberately low to protect objects that have survived longer than the cultures that made them, there is a small prism of baked clay. It stands approximately 8 inches tall, its 4 flat sides covered edge to edge in cuneiform script so densely packed that a magnifying lens is sometimes needed to distinguish one line from the next. The object was discovered in the early 20th century near the ancient site of Larsa, in what is now southern Iraq, purchased by an English traveller named Herbert Weld Blundell, and eventually donated to the Ashmoleans collection, where it has remained ever since under the catalogue designation WB444. Scholars call it the Sumerian King List. What it actually contains is something considerably harder to name cleanly. The document begins with a single line that refuses to behave like ordinary history. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It is the word descended that unsettles any straightforward reading. The text does not say that kingship emerged from human effort or developed through a process of tribal organization and delegation, or was established by the consent of early communities finding their way toward governance. It says descended, from heaven, to a specific city, as if the structure of rule was not invented by the people who practiced it, but delivered to them from somewhere above and apart, handed down intact to a world that had apparently been waiting for it. That framing quiet declarative entirely without elaboration sets the tone for everything that follows. What follows is a list, name, city, duration of reign, repeated with careful scribal consistency across 8 cities and their rulers before the text arrives toward its first great discontinuity. And it is in those durations that the quiet problem begins. Alulem of Eridu. The first king recorded is listed as having ruled for 28,800 years. His successor Alalgar for 36,000. The totals compound as the list proceeds through subsequent rulers, accumulating across 8 pre-flood cities to a combined span of 241,200 years before the text pauses and delivers its single pivot line. Then the flood swept over. One variant tablet WB62 extends the count even further, recording 10 pre-flood kings across a total of 456,000 years. The numbers are by any conventional measure impossible. They sit in the record like stones that belong to a different kind of river. Mainstream scholarship has a reasonable response to this. The long reigns, the argument goes, represent mythological inflation, a way of encoding reverence for a distant golden age, or perhaps scribal error accumulating across centuries of copying and recopying. This is not an unreasonable position, and it deserves to be held seriously. Ancient texts from many cultures use numerical hyperbole to suggest antiquity, divine favour, or the sheer weight of a legendary past. There is nothing inherently suspicious about that practice, and no single anomalous number in an ancient document obligates a revision of everything else. The skeptic position here is stable, and it should not be dismissed too quickly. And yet the numbers on WB444 do something that straightforward hyperbole does not typically do. They decline, not randomly, not in the scattered way that invented figures tend to cluster around culturally favoured numerals, but in a progression that holds consistently across the transition from pre-flood to post-flood records and continues decreasing as the list approaches periods that archaeology can verify. The first post-flood king, Gur of Kish, is recorded as ruling for 1,200 years, still impossible but dramatically shorter than his antediluvian predecessors. The dynasties that follow are shorter still, and the ones after those shorter again until the list reaches rulers whose existence can be confirmed through excavated palace remains, independent administrative archives, and clay seals, bearing names that match at which point the durations have descended into ranges we recognise without difficulty. 5 years, 12, 23. Some researchers have noted that this pattern of consistent decline is not what invented numbers usually look like, and the detail is small but it refuses to go away. The scribes who maintained this document across centuries at least 16 different copies or fragments have been identified, spanning nearly 1,000 years of copying, did not flag the pre-flood section as legendary or uncertain. They did not add marginal notations suggesting the early rains were symbolic. They preserved the numbers with the same care they brought to everything else on the list, in the same notational hand with the same structural repetition. This might mean nothing more than institutional inertia, a long tradition of copying what came before without interrogating it. But it might also suggest something about how those scribes understood the material they were handling, not as inherited fiction, but as preserved data information, whose significance they may not have fully grasped, but which they judged worth keeping intact. The distinction between those two readings is not trivial. One produces a document of religious imagination, the other produces something closer to an archive. The physical form of the prism is worth pausing on. 4 sides each fully inscribed, tapering slightly toward the top, the text wrapping continuously around the object from one dynasty to the next without clear division or pause. When rotated slowly, as scholars have done, as conservators have done, as visitors have presumably imagined doing, through the protective glass, the list moves without interruption. One ruling house leading into the next, the flood appearing not as a chapter break but as a single line embedded in the continuous flow. There is no obvious beginning and no obvious end. The text circles the object. Whether this was a practical decision made by a scribe with a certain quantity of clay and a certain quantity of information to record, or whether the shape itself was chosen to reflect something about the nature of the document's content, is not recorded anywhere in what survives. But the form is what it is, a column that turns, returning always to where it started. And in that turning, something is implied that the text never states directly that the pattern it documents may not be a line progressing towards some resolution, but something that circles back, that descends and resets and rises and descends again, that has perhaps already completed more iterations than the document is able to count. The flood that divides the pre-flood from the post-flood sections is not in the broader Sumerian literary record treated as a unique catastrophe. It is treated as a threshold, the most recent major threshold within accessible memory, which raises a question the scribes may have considered, without writing down how many thresholds came before it and how many may come after. To begin following that question, we move away from the prism in Oxford and toward a different set of texts, older in spirit, if not always in physical date, pressed into clay with a precision that has more in common with procedural instruction than with the language of myth. The geography of the House of Dust. The Sumerian word for underworld is a term that carries 2 meanings simultaneously, and the fact that a single word holds both without apparent contradiction tells you something about how the people who used it understood the relationship between the 2 things it names. The word is Kur, it means mountain, it also means netherworld. In a landscape as flat as the southern Mesopotamian plain, where the horizon extends without interruption in every direction, an elevation is something you travel toward rather than something you inhabit. The mountain was already a place apart, distant, vertical, belonging to a different order of geography than the alluvial mud underfoot. That the same word described the realm of the dead is not in this context a poetic accident. It suggests that the underworld was understood not as an absence of place, but as a specific kind of place, elevated in its separateness, bounded, structured, and as real in its own way as the mountains visible on the edge of the world. The dead did not go nowhere. They went somewhere with a name, a geography, and an administration. The texts that describe Kur in detail are numerous enough and consistent enough across different periods and scribal traditions to suggest that what they record is not the individual imagination of particular authors, but a shared and stable conception that was transmitted carefully across generations. The underworld in these texts is not a vague or formless realm. It has architecture, it has personnel, It has rules that apply universally that bind visitors and residents alike, and that even the gods who govern it are not empowered to simply set aside when circumstances become inconvenient. The entrance to Kür is located in the east in several texts at the place where the sun descends below the horizon, which implies that the sun's nightly disappearance was understood not as extinction, but as passage or transit through the underworld during the dark hours before emergence again at dawn. The daily cycle of light was in this reading a visible demonstration of the same pattern that governed everything else Descent residents in Darkness return. Access to Kür is controlled. This is not incidental to the texts that describe it, but central to them, and the detail is worth holding carefully. The entrance is guarded by a gatekeeper named Neti, who is described not in the language of mythological monster, but in the language of official function. He asks questions, he verifies authorities, he checks permissions, he enforces the protocol that governs what may be brought inside and what must be surrendered at each threshold. He does in the plainest possible terms paperwork. The bureaucratic texture of this description is one of the more quietly striking features of Sumerian afterlife literature, because it places the realm of the dead within the same administrative framework that governed every other aspect of Sumerian civic life. Kür is not chaos. It is managed territory subject to the same logic of record-keeping and jurisdictional rule that managed grain storage and land tenure, and the movement of livestock across city boundaries. Beyond the entrance, the passage into Kür is structured around 7 gates. This number appears across multiple texts with a consistency that resists easy dismissal. Not 6 gates, not 8-7 specifically, each representing a threshold at which something must be surrendered before passage continues. The most detailed account of this passage survives in the Descent of Inanna, a text reconstructed from multiple tablet fragments including British Museum Kebu 162, in which the goddess moves through each gate sequentially yielding at every threshold one of her divine attributes, her crown, her lapis lazuli necklace, her breastplate, her ball, her golden ring, her measuring rod, her robe, until she arrives at the innermost chamber, stripped of everything that defined her as a sovereign being. The gatekeeper's response to her questions at each removal is identical, repeated with deliberate precision, "Be silent, Inanna." The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. That repetition is not poetic emphasis, it is documentation of a system that operates according to fixed rules regardless of who is subject to them, and the detail refuses to go away across every version of the text that survives. The 7-gate structure extends beyond the descent narrative itself. It appears in the physical architecture of Mesopotamian ziggurats, which were built with 7 ascending levels, suggesting that the cosmological significance of the number was embedded in built form as well as in written text. It appears in ritual processions that paused at 7 designated stations. It appears in the enumeration of the 7 Anunnaki, the judges of the underworld, who pass sentence on those who arrive in Kür's innermost chamber. Whether the number 7 was chosen because it held a prior symbolic meaning that was then applied across these different contexts, or whether it was arrived at through some form of observation that multiple traditions independently confirmed, is a question the texts do not answer. Some researchers argue for the former, that 7 was simply a number of completion in ancient Near Eastern numerology used wherever totality needed to be expressed. Others note the cross-cultural persistence of 7 as a structuring number in systems as different from each other as yogic chakra theory, Islamic cosmological hierarchies, and early Christian moral taxonomy, and suggest that this breadth of independent attestation may indicate something beyond shared symbolism. It may be natural, it may be chance. The discomfort is that we cannot be entirely sure which. What the texts are clear about is what happens after the 7 gates have been passed. The dead arrive in a place the Sumerian literary record calls with characteristic specificity the House of Dust. They eat dust. They drink brackish water. They exist in darkness. And yet, and this is where the geography of Kür becomes more complex than a simple terminus, they remain aware. They recognize visitors. They remember their lives. They retain enough identity to make requests to express grief to respond when summoned by those who know the proper procedures. The dead in Kür are not extinguished. They are relocated. And a place to which the living can travel, from which messages can be retrieved, and through which at least some beings have been documented, as returning is not quite the same thing as an ending. What it is and what the text suggests it may be a stage within carries us forward into the narrative that describes the passage most completely. A journey undertaken not in myth alone, but in something the scribes recorded with the calm precision of a technical manual, the procedural death of a goddess. What distinguishes a manual from a myth is not the presence of gods or impossible events. Both can contain those. What distinguishes them is the quality of attention given to sequence, whether the text cares about the order in which things happen, whether it specifies durations, whether it assigns exact quantities to processes that a purely symbolic narrative would leave approximate. By that measure, the descent of Inanna reconstructed from multiple tablet fragments including British Museum K162 and composite sources from the cuneiform Digital Library Initiative reads less like a religious story and more like something a careful observer pressed into clay because the steps mattered and the steps needed to be preserved in the correct order for reasons that the text does not pause to explain. The narrative begins before the descent itself with a detail that is easy to overlook but that carries considerable weight. Before Inanna begins her journey downward, she instructs her minister Ninshupa to wait 3 days and 3 nights. If she has not returned by the end of that period, Ninshupa is to seek help from the gods. This instruction establishes the 3-day duration not as something discovered after the fact, but as something anticipated in advance, a known parameter of the process, built into the preparation for a journey that Inanna has apparently undertaken with some understanding of how long its critical phase will last. She knows she will be dead. She knows for approximately how long, and she arranges accordingly. That foreknowledge is one of the quieter and more structurally significant details in the entire text, because it implies that the 3-day death period is not an arbitrary consequence of what happens below, but a feature of the system itself, predictable enough to plan around. The descent then proceeds through the 7 gates in a sequence already described: 7 surrenders, 7 removals, the progressive stripping of every attribute that constitutes divine identity, until Inanna arrives in the throne room of Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, naked and without power or protection of any kind. The 7 Anunnaki, the judges of the underworld, pass judgment against her immediately. The method of her death is not specified. The text says only that she was struck and then she was dead, and then her corpse was hung on a hook. The word used for the hook, a gizbar, a wooden peg of the kind used in practical domestic contexts to hang meat, is specific in a way that resists symbolic softening. The text is not describing a spiritual transition or a metaphorical dissolution. It is describing a body treated as an object suspended in the darkness of the underworld's innermost chamber. And then the counting begins. For 3 days and 3 nights Inanna is dead. The text does not compress this into a summary. It counts. 1 day, 1 night. 2 days, 2 nights. 3 days, 3 nights. The repetition is deliberate and the precision is the point, and this is where the quiet problem deepens. Mesopotamian burial practice involved interment typically within hours of death. Bodies were not left exposed for extended observation periods. The 3-day count would not in most ordinary circumstances correlate with any visually observable change in the deceased, which raises the question of what the 3 days is actually measuring, if not decomposition, and the text characteristically does not answer directly. It simply insists on the duration with the same matter-of-fact tone it uses for everything else. On the 3rd day, with Inanna still hanging in the darkness, Ninshuba carries out the pre-arranged instructions. She appeals to Enlil. He refuses. She appeals to Nanna. He refuses. Then she appeals to Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, and Enki responds differently. From the dirt beneath his fingernails, not from divine substance, not from sacred materials, but from something incidental, almost accidental. He fashions 2 small beings described as neither male nor female, neither conventionally alive nor divine. They carry no divine attributes of their own, which means the rules of the underworld have no mechanism for recognizing or detaining them. They can enter Kur without being subject to its protocols, and Enki gives them specific instructions specifying not only what to do, but in what precise quantities to do it. They are to find Ereshkigal in distress. The text describes her groaning suffering, though the cause is not given, and they are to empathize with her, reflecting her pain back to her with genuine sympathetic response until she offers them a reward. When she does, they are to ask for the corpse on the hook, And then they are to apply the food of life and the water of life to that corpse 53 times. Not 50, not 55, 53. The specificity of that number is by any reasonable standard the most technically striking detail in the entire text. Mythological narratives do not typically require odd non-round quantities. They favour numbers with symbolic weight 3, 7, 12, 40. 53 carries no obvious symbolic resonance in the Sumerian system. Some researchers have suggested it encodes an empirical observation that this is how many applications of some particular ritual substance were found through repeated practice to be necessary before the desired effect was reliably achieved. Whether that reading is correct cannot be confirmed. But the number sits in the text the way an experimental result sits in a laboratory record, specific, unrepeated, and not obviously explained by anything other than the possibility that someone counted. The creatures follow the instructions precisely. Eresh Gigal, moved by their empathy, grants the corpse. The food and water of life are applied the specified number of times. Inanna rises, and here the text shifts from the mechanics of resurrection to the mechanics of what resurrection costs, because the law of the underworld presented in every version of this narrative as absolute and non-negotiable requires that anyone who enters and then exits must provide a substitute. The system, whatever else it is, must remain balanced. Someone must always be below for every being that walks above. That requirement, structural, impersonal, indifferent to individual circumstance, will shape everything that follows, and it carries us directly into the nature of the being that persists after the body has been taken down from the hook. The giddim and the thread that continues in old Babylonian commercial correspondence dating to approximately 1900 BCE letters concerned with trade disputes, debt obligations, and the movement of silver between merchants and a formulaic phrase appears with enough regularity to suggest it was not invented fresh each time, but drawn from an established legal and cultural vocabulary. The phrase is, "I swear by the giddims of my father." It invokes as a witness to a contractual promise, not a god, not a king, not an abstract principle of justice, but the persistent essence of a specific dead person, a father in this case whose existence has not ended with his body's burial, but has continued in a form capable of serving as a reliable and morally weighted witness to the living. The casual practical context in which this invocation appears is significant. This is not temple literature. This is not ritual poetry. This is a merchant settling an account, reaching for the most credible form of guarantee available and finding it in the continued existence of the dead. What that implies about how the giddim was understood in everyday Sumerian and Babylonian life is worth sitting with for a moment before moving further. The word giddim, rendered in Akkadian as a temu, is typically translated into English as ghost or spirit. But both of those words carry connotations that distort the Mesopotamian concept in important ways. Ghost implies something residual, diminished, a pale remainder of what once was. Spirit implies something immaterial, hovering at the boundary between presence and absence. The giddim is neither of these things exactly. It is described in the texts as a natural consequence of human existence, as inevitable as breath, as shadow, as the impression a foot leaves in wet clay. Every person has one. When the body dies, the giddim continues. This is not presented as a theology or as a belief that requires defense or elaboration. It is simply how things work, stated in the same declarative register used to describe how barley grows or how bronze is forged. The factual plainness of that framing is itself a kind of evidence about the cultural status of the claim. What the giddim retains is, by the account of multiple texts across different periods, considerable. It keeps the personality of the person it belonged to. It keeps their memories. It keeps enough of their emotional and relational life that when summoned or encountered in dreams, the dead recognize family members, remember their unfinished obligations, express preferences about how their graves are tended, and occasionally communicate information that the living could not have obtained any other way. A tablet from the old Assyrian period excavated at Kanesh and published in the journal Religions in 2025 describes merchants consulting the dead, the Akkadian plural etemu, for information about market conditions and political situations in cities too distant to reach quickly by foot. The dead were considered reliable sources precisely because they were not constrained by the limitations of embodied existence. They could perceive things the living could not. And that capacity for perception retained across the threshold of death suggests that whatever the giddim is, it is not simply a fading echo. It is something structured enough to maintain function. The giddim can also suffer. This is documented with a specificity that resists being read as purely metaphorical. Funerary offerings in the Sumerian record are not optional gestures of sentiment but necessary provisions. The texts are consistent on this point, and the language used to describe what happens when those provisions are withheld is the language of physical deprivation. The dead in Kür eat dust and drink brackish water unless their living relatives supply better. The giddim is described as weeping as cold as hungry in terms that carry tactile weight. Whether this describes a literal embodied experience in some form we do not understand, or whether it is the closest available language for something that has no precise equivalent in the vocabulary of the living, the texts do not clarify. But the consistency with which this suffering is described across different genres, ritual instruction, lamentation, poetry, administrative funerary records suggests it was understood as real in some operative sense, real enough to motivate sustained behavioral obligations in the living. The giddim can return. This is perhaps the most practically significant aspect of its character as the texts describe it, and it is where the documentary precision of the Sumerian record becomes most concentrated. Necromantic practice in Mesopotamia is not a fringe element of its literary tradition. It is documented in procedural texts that specify techniques, conditions, permissible contexts, and consequences of misapplication. A ritual specialist under controlled circumstances could bring a giddim back from Kür temporarily for the duration of a consultation, typically to answer questions, confirm information, or fulfill some obligation that had been left incomplete at death. The texts acknowledge this as possible, while simultaneously warning against casual use, the way a technical manual might describe a procedure that works reliably but carries significant risk if performed without adequate preparation. The procedural language surrounding necromancy is like the procedural language surrounding the Seven Gates, more consistent with documented practice than with invented mythology. What emerges from these combined descriptions is a picture of something that operates more like a persistent organizational structure than like a fading impression. The giddim maintains identity. It maintains memory. It maintains the capacity to perceive, to suffer, to communicate, and to return under specific conditions. It resides in Kür, but it is not defined by or dissolved into Kür. It remains itself within the underworld's administration, subject to that administration's rules, occupying a specific position in the geography of the House of Dust, but retaining enough coherence to be recognized, summoned, and engaged with by the living who know the correct procedures. The detail is quiet but structurally important, a thing that can be reliably summoned from a specific location identified by name and consulted for information is not a metaphor. It is a documented entity in a documented place operating within a documented system. Whether that system is one in which the giddim's residence in Kür is permanent or temporary, whether the House of Dust is a terminus or a way station, is the question. The texts approach most carefully and answer most obliquely, and it leads us directly into the figure whose annual cycle of death and return, the Sumerian ritual calendar, tracked with the same precision it brought to the movement of planets. The shepherd who descends on schedule. There is a category of event that a culture treats differently depending on whether it understands that event as something that happened once long ago or as something that happens now, regularly on a predictable schedule. The former produces commemoration rituals of remembrance oriented toward a fixed point in the past. The latter produces participation rituals of engagement oriented toward a recurring present in which the event being marked is not a memory but an occurrence. The annual laments for Dumuzi performed across Mesopotamian cities for a period spanning at least 2,000 years belong unmistakably to the second category. The women who gathered in temple courtyards to mourn him, tearing their clothing, weeping, loudly entering states of grief that contemporary observers described as genuine and unperformed, were not commemorating a death that had happened in mythological time. They were responding to a death that was happening now in this season, in this year, as it had happened in the previous year and would happen in the year that followed. The ritual calendar did not say remember when Dumuzi died. It said Dumuzi is dying. The distinction is not subtle, and it shaped everything about how the cycle was understood. The earliest texts associated with Dumuzi date to the early dynastic period around 2600 BC, making them among the oldest religious literature that survives anywhere. In these early materials, his identity is already fully formed around the pattern that will define him across every subsequent century of attestation. He is the shepherd king, the consort of Inanna, the being whose presence above ground corresponds with seasons of fertility and whose absence below corresponds with seasons of withering. But the texts are consistent across their full span in presenting the seasonal change not as the cause of his cycle, but as its visible effect. Dumuzi does not descend to the underworld because summer arrives. Summer arrives because Dumuzi has descended. The mechanism is primary. The weather is downstream of it. That directional framing cosmic pattern producing observable consequence, rather than observable consequence inspiring invented pattern, is one of the more persistent structural features of how the Sumerians documented their understanding of how existence works. The narrative of his death reconstructed from multiple tablet fragments including British Museum SP2464 and the composite texts known as the Dream of Dumuzi and the Return of Dumuzi describes a pursuit. The demons sent from Kur to collect the substitute that Inanna has designated find Dumuzi on his throne in Uruk, apparently untroubled, sitting in the kind of ease that reads in the context of what is about to happen as either ignorance or resignation. Inanna designates him with the deliberate weight of someone who has considered the choice and made it. The demons see him and take him. What follows is a chase Dumuzi fleeing, transforming himself into a gazelle to evade capture, hiding in locations that his sister Geshtinana refuses to reveal even under torture, that has the texture of grief more than adventure, the quality of someone running from something that was always going to catch him. The chase does not end in escape. It ends in capture, and then in descent through the same sequence of thresholds that defines every passage into Kur, each gate taking something, each threshold reducing him further until he arrives in the darkness below. In a state the texts describe with the same word used for Inanna's condition, meat on a hook suspended in the underworld's administration waiting. What makes Dumuzi's story structurally distinct from Inanna's is not the descent but the arrangement that follows. Geshtinana's refusal to accept her brother's permanent loss and her offers to share his fate produces the compromise that the gods formalize. Dumuzi will spend half the year in the underworld Geshtinana, the other half each taking turns as the substitute, so that neither is permanently below and neither is permanently above. This arrangement creates a cycle with no terminal point. It does not resolve into freedom for either sibling. It does not end with Dumuzi achieving permanent resurrection, or finding a way to exit the system entirely. It simply continues half and half descent and return death and life turning without conclusion, because the system's requirement that someone must always be below is not a temporary condition to be overcome, but a structural feature of how the whole thing is maintained. And the texts present this not as tragedy, but as permanent architecture. This is how it is. This is how it will continue. The ritual tracking of Dumuzi's cycle was conducted with the same mathematical precision that Mesopotamian astronomers brought to planetary motion. The priests who maintained the calendars that governed when laments would be performed and when celebrations would replace them were the same scribes who calculated helical risings and predicted lunar eclipses. They did not separate these activities into different categories of knowledge. The movement of Dumuzi through the underworld and back was tracked with observational rigour. Its dates calculated against both lunar and solar reference points, its transitions marked in temple records alongside the positions of Venus, and the expected timing of seasonal rains. This equivalence, Dumuzi's descent on the same ledger as a planet's disappearance below the horizon, may be the most quietly significant detail the ritual record preserves, because it implies that the scribes understood his cycle as operating according to the same kind of fixed, predictable, mathematically expressible law that governed celestial mechanics. Not a story that happened to correlate with the seasons. A mechanism as reliable as orbital motion, as countable as the days between a star's last visibility and its first reappearance. Some researchers argue this equivalence reflects nothing more than a culture that had not yet separated religious from astronomical observation. Others note that the precision with which both were tracked suggests the separation may not have been the point, that to the Sumerian scribal tradition, both were simply aspects of a single documented system operating at different scales of the same underlying pattern. The grave of a woman excavated at Ur, dating to approximately 2600 BCE, contained among its burial objects a small clay tablet bearing a fragment of a Dumuzi lament. She was buried with gold jewellery, lapis lazuli ornaments and cylinder seals objects of considerable material value, but also with this text pressed into clay, placed beside her body as deliberately as any of the more tangible provisions. The lament fragment has been interpreted variously as a devotional object, a marker of priestly or cultic affiliation, and a funerary gift from mourners who considered it appropriate. But the return of Dumuzi contains a line that offers another possible reading like Dumuzi, you have gone to the dark place. Like Dumuzi, you will return. The you in that line is grammatically ambiguous. It may address Dumuzi himself. It may address the worshippers who perform the ritual. It may address anyone who hears the text. But it establishes a continuity that the burial at Ur seems to materialize. The woman in that grave was descending into the same darkness, and someone who loved her or prepared her body thought it mattered that she carry with her the words that describe the pattern her descent belonged to. Whether that pattern extends beyond the divine, whether the cycle that governs Dumuzi also governs the giddim of every person who has ever been interred with inadequate provisions, and a clay tablet for company, is the question the texts approach most obliquely, and it becomes considerably harder to set aside when examined alongside the Sumerian understanding of what resets an entire civilization, not just an individual life. The weight of reasonable doubt. A quiet question has been present at the edges of everything covered so far, and it deserves its own space, not because it dissolves what the texts describe, but because honest engagement with the evidence requires holding the counter-arguments with the same care given to the pattern itself. The Sumerians were careful observers. That much is well established, and the track record of their astronomical, mathematical and medical documentation provides a legitimate basis for taking their other records seriously. But careful observation and accurate interpretation are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where the most substantial objections to this entire framework live. Those objections are worth examining without hurry because they are not trivial, and because the pattern the texts describe becomes more rather than less interesting when held against the strongest version of the case against it. The first and most structurally significant objection concerns the nature of mythological numbers, the impossibly long reigns in the Sumerian king list. The argument goes are not anomalous data points in an otherwise empirical document. They are a recognizable feature of ancient Near Eastern literary convention, a way of encoding the idea of a golden age, of expressing reverence for an incomprehensibly distant past, of asserting the legitimacy of present kingship by connecting it to origins that predate ordinary human memory. This practice appears in other ancient traditions, with enough consistency to constitute a pattern of its own. The Hebrew patriarchs in Genesis live for hundreds of years. Early kings in Egyptian king lists are assigned to reigns of comparable implausibility. Sumerian scribes working within a shared Near Eastern literary culture would have had access to these conventions and no particular reason to resist them.
The Delhimarskap.
Declining trajectory of the king list's reign lengths, the feature that the documentation interpretation finds most significant, might reflect nothing more than an increasing proximity to verifiable history as the list progresses, with earlier sections freed from the constraints of archival record and later sections increasingly anchored to them. The numbers shrink not because a cosmic parameter was changing, but because the scribes were getting closer to events they actually knew something about, and invention becomes more conservative when checked against living memory. This is a reasonable position. It accounts for the data without requiring anything unusual. The second objection concerns the cross-cultural convergence that the 7-get structure and the 3-day death period seem to exhibit. The persistence of 7 as a structuring number across yogic tradition, Islamic cosmology, Christian moral taxonomy, and Mesopotamian underworld architecture is cited as evidence that the number may encode something real, a genuine stage count in a process that multiple independent traditions observed and documented using their own symbolic languages. But the simpler explanation, and in most analytical frameworks the preferred one, is that 7 is a number with strong cognitive and perceptual salience across human cultures generally. It sits at the upper boundary of what most people can hold in working memory without counting. It divides naturally into asymmetric groupings 3 and 4, for instance, that appear repeatedly in structured ritual and narrative. Its cross-cultural prevalence may reflect the architecture of human cognition rather than the architecture of the cosmos. Similarly, the 3-day death period striking as its recurrence is across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Norse, and early Christian traditions may reflect the observable biology of decomposition, the psychological duration of acute grief, or simply the cognitive tendency to organize time into tripartite structures. None of these explanations require anything beyond well-documented features of human psychology and cultural transmission. The discomfort is not that the objection is wrong. It is that it's not quite sufficient either, because it explains the convergence without explaining the procedural specificity, the 53 applications, the exact gate count, the pre-arranged 3-day waiting period that accompanies the symbolic numbers in these particular texts. The third objection is perhaps the most fundamental and the most honest. It concerns the interpretive leap from documented pattern to claimed mechanism. No single Sumerian tablet states that human giddim reincarnate. No text in the surviving corpus says directly that death is a way station in a cycle of return that applies universally to human consciousness. What the texts describe are divine cycles, Inanna's descent and resurrection, Dumuzi's annual death and return, and a theory of the persistent human spirit that notes its retention of memory and identity after death without specifying what ultimately happens to it across very long periods of time. The reincarnation reading, however internally consistent it may be, when the fragments are assembled together, is a synthesis, a construction built from pieces that individually point in suggestive directions without any one of them arriving at the destination the synthesis reaches. The scribes who pressed these observations into clay may have understood their own system in ways that the assembled picture does not accurately represent. They may have understood it in ways that the surviving fragments are too incomplete to communicate, or they may have understood it in exactly the way the synthesis suggests, and chosen not to state it plainly because some knowledge was restricted, or because it was considered too obvious to require statement, or because the tablets that would have made it explicit have not survived. Any of these possibilities is open. None of them can be closed. What remains after these objections have been given their full weight is not a refuted hypothesis, but an unresolved one. The pattern the texts describe is real, in the sense that it appears consistently across genres, period cities, and scribal traditions that were not all in direct communication with each other. The procedural precision of those texts is real in the sense that it exceeds what decorative mythology typically requires. The Sumerian track record in domains we can verify is real in the sense that it provides a rational basis for taking their unverifiable claims more seriously than we might extend to cultures with less documented accuracy. And the objections are real in the sense that they are not easily dismissed and should not be. What the evidence produces, held honestly, is not certainty in either direction. It produces the particular quality of discomfort that attends a question that has not been answered. A question about whether the system these texts describe is a system we are inside, whether the cycle they document is one we are cycling through, whether the pattern that appears at every scale they examined also applies at the scale of individual human existence, repeating without resolution whether we recognize it or not. That discomfort does not resolve, but it does point somewhere toward the event that the Sumerian record presents as the largest single reset within accessible memory, and toward what the texts suggest was preserved through it and what was lost. The flood that resets the wheel. In the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, in a storage environment maintained at conditions calibrated to prevent the continued deterioration of objects that have already survived 4,000 years, there is a tablet fragment designated CBS 1673. It is one of the primary surviving pieces of the text. Scholars call the Eridu Genesis, the oldest written flood narrative in the world, composed in Sumerian probably around 2300 BCE, though the events it describes are presented not as recent history but as something much older, something the scribes themselves were already looking back towards across a considerable span of time. The tablet is damaged, significant portions are missing. What remains is fragmentary enough that reconstruction requires comparison with related texts, careful logical inference, and a degree of interpretive humility about which gaps have been filled correctly and which may have been filled wrongly. And yet what survives is sufficient to establish the structure of the account, and it is the structure more than any individual detail that carries the weight of what the Sumerian flood narratives collectively suggest. The Eridogenesis begins in the sections that survive with the creation of humanity and the establishment of 5 cities, Eridu Bad Tibira, Laraxipa, and Shurapak. These are not mythological places. They are archaeological sites excavated, stratified their occupation layers, dated through material evidence. The text then moves through a period of flourishing before arriving at the decision of the gods to destroy humanity with a flood. The god Enki characteristically dissents from this decision, or rather navigates around it through a technical maneuver that will become familiar across the later versions of the same story. He does not warn the flood's designated survivor directly, because he has sworn an oath not to. Instead, he speaks to a reed wall, while Ziusudra listens on the other side, hearing the warning without Enki having technically delivered it to a person. The flood comes. It lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When it ends, Ziusudra makes offerings, the gods are appeased, and the text delivers the line that mirrors the King List's opening, almost exactly after the flood had swept over the kingship descended from heaven to Kish. Not returned to Kish, descended again from heaven. As if the mechanism of governance had been lifted up, protected during the catastrophe, and then reintroduced. The same pattern, the same word, the same directional logic as the very first line of the political chronicle preserved on WB 444 in Oxford. The Atrahasis epic, composed in Akkadian and surviving in multiple tablet sets from different periods, provides more context for why the flood was decided upon, and the context is not immoral. Humanity was not destroyed because it had become wicked or impious or had violated divine commandments in ways that required punishment. Humanity was destroyed because it had become too numerous and too loud. The text specifies that the noise, the clamour of human population at a scale that had grown beyond what the gods found tolerable was the operative problem. Several prior attempts had been made to reduce human numbers through plague, drought, and famine, each of which failed because Enki quietly advised Atrahasis on countermeasures. The flood was the final attempt at a solution that previous interventions had not provided, not reduction, but set a comprehensive clearing that would allow resumption at a manageable scale. The language around this is administrative rather than judicial. It reads less like divine wrath and more like resource management, a decision made by authorities who found that a system had exceeded its sustainable parameters and required intervention to bring it back within a durable range. And after the intervention, Enki argues successfully for a compromise. Implement better population controls going forward so that future resets of this magnitude become unnecessary. The flood is framed in this version not as a punishment with an ending, but as one instance in a series of corrective measures, the most extreme of which need not be repeated if the underlying conditions are managed more carefully. The flood account embedded in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, told to Gilgamesh directly by Utnapishtim, the survivor, in the voice of a man describing his own past, adds a quality of loss that the earlier versions do not foreground as explicitly. Utnapishtim describes a world before the flood that was in some ways that he does not fully specify better than what came after. Not simply more populated or more prosperous, but operating under conditions that the flood permanently altered. The implication, never stated outright, is that the reset did not merely reduce the quantity of what existed, but degraded something about the quality of the conditions under which existence was conducted. Something changed at the threshold of the flood that could not be restored by simply rebuilding cities and resuming governance. And this reading aligns with what the King List records numerically, that the parameters of individual existence as encoded in reign lengths were shorter after the flood than before, and continued shortening as subsequent generations accumulated, each iteration carrying less than the one that preceded it. What all 3 accounts share beneath their differences in framing and emphasis is a structural template that the Sumerian scribes appear to have recognized as repeating. Growth beyond sustainable parameters. Decision by the administering powers that reset is necessary. Catastrophic clearing. Preservation of a seed one man, his family specimens of life and knowledge through the destruction. Reintroduction of the essential pattern at a reduced scale. Resumption of growth that will presumably eventually require another reset. The texts do not present this template as unique to the flood they describe. They present it as the shape that major transitions take the form that catastrophic correction follows when smaller interventions have failed. And if that template describes how civilizational cycles operate, the question it raises about what came before the oldest accessible flood, And what may come after the next one is one the surviving texts approach, but do not answer with any finality. Gilgamesh found tablets written before the flood preserved in a stone box by someone who understood that catastrophe was coming and wanted knowledge to survive. The Sumerians found older tablets in the languages they could barely read. Each layer of preservation gestures toward a layer before it that is mostly lost. What was lost in the most recent reset and what the scribes were most anxious to preserve against the next one brings us to the specific mechanisms they documented for how identity and knowledge might be carried across the threshold of catastrophe. Not at the scale of civilizations, but at the scale of a single persistent self. The mechanics of the substitute self. One date sits in the record like a stone in a shoe. In the spring of 671 BCE, during the reign of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, a series of omens was observed by the court astronomers at Nineveh. Lunar eclipse patterns combined with the behavior of certain planets in specific houses of the sky that the diviners interpreted as predicting the imminent death of the king. This was not an unusual occurrence in the administrative life of a Mesopotamian court. Omen literature was a highly developed technical discipline, its practitioners trained across years of apprenticeship in the reading of celestial, terrestrial and biological signs, and the prediction of royal death through ominous convergence was a recognized category of interpretation with an established protocol for response. What is unusual about the 671 BCE case is the detail with which it was recorded. The specific omens identified the deliberations of the diviners, the identity of the man selected to serve as substitute, and the precise timing of his death preserved across multiple clay tablets that allow the event to be reconstructed with a clarity rare for events of this period. The protocol that was activated in response to those omens is called the Apu ritual, the substitute king ceremony, and what it reveals about how the Sumerian and Babylonian understanding of identity and fate operated at a practical level is more structurally significant than it might initially appear. The logic of the ritual rests on a premise that the texts treat as entirely matter-of-fact that fate as generated by ominous configuration attaches to a role rather than to a specific biological person. When the omens predict the death of the king, they are predicting the death of whoever occupies the function of kingship at that moment. Whoever wears the crown sits on the throne, receives the offerings and bears the title. If the actual king can be temporarily displaced from that function and a substitute installed in his place who genuinely occupies the role for the duration of the ominous period, then the death the omens foretold will find the substitute rather than the original. The cosmic mechanism in this reading operates according to designation rather than biological identity. It tracks the role, not the person. And this implies something with considerable reach, that identity in the sense that matters to whatever system governs fate and death and return is more like a position in a structure than like an irreducible essence permanently attached to a particular body. The substitute dies and the system is satisfied because the system was never tracking the body. It was tracking the designation. The ritual's implementation was meticulous. The substitute, typically a man of low social standing, sometimes a prisoner, occasionally someone drawn from marginal categories of the population, was installed on the throne with full ceremonial formality. He was dressed in royal regalia. He was addressed with royal titles. He was given a queen, usually a woman, selected for the occasion to complete the formal picture of occupying the kingship in every dimension the role required. The real king, meanwhile, was removed from the palace and given a different name, a different identity, a different designation, becoming for the duration of the dangerous period someone else, someone the omens had not targeted. This substitution was not a deception practiced on the gods in a spirit of defiance. It was understood as operating within the rules of the system, using those rules as they were designed to be used by people who understood them well enough to work with their grain rather than against it. The cosmos accepts the substitute because the cosmos tracks designation and the designation has been legitimately transferred. What happened to the substitute at the end of the ominous period was recorded without ceremony in the administrative documents that tracked these events. He was killed. The manner varied across attestations, but the timing was specific, aligned with the close of the dangerous window, identified by the original omens, and the records of his death were kept alongside the records of the ritual's initiation with the same clerical neutrality applied to any other administrative outcome. He died as the king, which meant the death the omens required had been fulfilled, and the real king could resume his identity, his title, his throne and his life. The system's demand had been met. the balance had been maintained. And this is where the detail becomes quietly difficult to set aside. A cosmic mechanism that can be satisfied by a substitute is a mechanism that does not fundamentally distinguish between different biological instances of a designated function. The role is what persists, Darcy's, or persists. The body that occupies it is interchangeable. Applied to the broader framework of the giddim and the cycle of descent. And return the substitute ritual suggests something about how identity might function across multiple incarnations that the reincarnation-adjacent reading of these texts requires, but that is rarely made explicit. If the cosmic mechanism tracks designation rather than body, then the giddim's return in a new material form does not require that the new form carry forward all the surface characteristics of the previous one. Name, physical appearance, specific memory is accessible to waking consciousness. It requires only that the essential designation, the deep structural identity that the giddim constitutes, be present and operative in the new form. The new body is a new substitute bearing the same underlying function, satisfying the system's requirement for a body to occupy a particular position in the living world. The memory of previous occupancies might not transfer in any form the new consciousness can access directly, but the giddim beneath it carries the continuity, the thread that connects iteration to iteration, the way the kingship continues across different bodies without any individual body constituting the kingship itself. Whether the Babylonian scribes who recorded the substitute king ritual understood it as evidence for something broader about the nature of identity across cycles, or whether they simply documented the procedure as effective practice without drawing theoretical conclusions is not recorded. What is recorded is the procedure, its internal logic, and its consistent application across centuries of Mesopotamian court life. And the internal logic of the procedure held alongside the giddim's documented retention of identity through death suggests a conception of selfhood far more layered than the modern default assumption, one in which what you essentially are and what you currently appear to be are not the same thing. And the system that governs your fate has always been tracking the former indifferent to the latter. That layering is made visible most clearly in the one place where the Sumerian record attempts to describe in the most direct available language what the experience of cycling through this structure might actually feel like from the inside. What the cycle feels like from inside. Consider what it would mean to remember something you have no ordinary means of knowing. Not a fact retrieved from reading. Not an inference drawn from experience. Not a pattern assembled gradually from accumulated observation. But a specific textured piece of knowledge, a place you recognize before you have visited it, a name that carries emotional weight before you have learned whose it is, a sequence of events that presents itself to waking consciousness with the quiet insistence of something that happened rather than something imagined. The Sumerian record does not address this phenomenon directly. It does not contain a text titled Instructions for Recognizing Your Previous Existence, or a tablet that says, "When you return here is how you will know." What it contains instead is a distributed body of evidence, dream records, necromantic consultation accounts, funerary administrative documents, and the specific language of ritual lament that assembled carefully outlines a framework within which this kind of experience would not be anomalous but structurally expected. The framework does not require the experience to explain itself. It simply describes the mechanism from which the experience would naturally follow if the mechanism is real. The Sumerian and Babylonian dream literature is extensive, and its treatment of encounters with the dead is notably consistent across the centuries it spans. When a deceased person appears in a dream in these texts, the encounter is not vague or symbolic in the way that modern psychological frameworks tend to describe dream content. The dead arrive with specificity. They identify themselves. They speak in their own voice, with their own personality, expressing concerns and communicating information that bears on situations in the waking world. A tablet from Nippur describes a man who encounters his dead father at a gate in a dream, the father attempting to pass through but lacking the required token detained at a threshold that the dreamer cannot help him cross. The fragment is damaged enough that the resolution is lost, but what survives is the precision of the encounter, a specific location, a specific obstacle, a specific attempt at communication across a boundary that both parties understand as real. The dead man is not a projection of the dreamer's grief. He is a person located somewhere trying to navigate a system whose rules apply to him whether he fully understands them or not. And the detail is structurally important. The encounter happens at a gate. Priests in Nipper maintained what appeared to be active records of the deceased, not genealogical commemorations, but functional rosters updated regularly from which names were occasionally removed after certain periods or under conditions that the surviving fragments do not fully specify. The removal of names from a list of the dead implies at minimum that remaining dead was understood as a category from which this transition was possible. What transition toward what destination the administrative records do not say. But an accounting system that tracks inputs and outputs in a population of the dead is by its structure a system that expects movement, not stasis, not permanent residence, but flux, the kind of managed circulation that requires record keeping precisely because things do not simply stay where they are placed. Some researchers have suggested these records track the standard duration of funerary obligation, removing names when the living's ritual responsibilities toward a specific deceased person were considered complete. This may be correct, but the possibility that they tracked something about the deceased's own progression through the underworld's administration and movement toward whatever comes next in the cycle is not excluded by what survives, and the pattern recurrence here is quiet but persistent. The phenomenon the texts gesture toward most obliquely is the one that appears most frequently in accounts from cultures entirely unconnected to Mesopotamia, children who describe with unprompted specificity lives they have not lived in this body. The Sumerian framework does not cite this. It predates the documentation of such accounts by millennia, but it describes in its account of the giddim's retention of memory and identity through death, a mechanism from which such accounts would follow naturally if the cycle operates as described. The giddim carries memory, the giddim returns. The boundary between the giddim's stored experience and the new consciousness's accessible experience is in the normal operation of the system, effectively complete the gate strip enough that ordinary waking life proceeds without interference from previous iterations. But the boundary is described as having permeability under specific conditions. Necromantic summoning, dream encounter the right ritual context applied by someone with the correct procedural knowledge. If the boundary is permeable in those controlled circumstances, it may be intermittently permeable in uncontrolled ones as well. Moments when the separation between what the giddim holds and what the new consciousness can access becomes briefly incomplete. What leaks through in those moments would present itself exactly as it is reported to present itself across cultural traditions that have no documented connection to each other, as memory that feels like lived experience, arriving with the emotional texture and spatial detail that invented imagery does not typically carry. The Sumerian texts do not offer this as an explanation for anything. They simply describe the machinery, the giddim's retention, the gate's stripping functions, the conditions under which the boundary becomes porous, and leave the implications to distribute themselves across whatever evidence happens to accumulate. The 53 applications of the food and water of life suggest that even the most controlled resurrection involved a gradual process of reconstruction, not an instantaneous return. A giddim reassembling itself across the threshold of return might do so unevenly, incompletely, with some material from the previous iteration arriving in the new consciousness before the full separation has established itself. The child who remembers a name from a life they did not live in this body may simply be a case where the reconstruction was not yet complete when waking consciousness first began to register the world. And then, as days become weeks and weeks become years, the separation closes. The memory fades into something that feels like a dream that is already receding, and the new life proceeds as if it were the only one. What the Sumerian record suggests, held carefully and without overstatement, is that this fading is not loss of something that never existed. It is the system functioning as designed, and the gates doing what gates do, the stripping proceeding as it always precedes the new iteration beginning in the condition the cycle requires. And the one place where the texts are most explicit about what drives the cycle's continuation without resolution brings us to the scale at which it operates most visibly, not in an individual life, not in a divine descent, but in the entire arc of a civilization building, reaching its limits and being swept over. The city, built on the city that burned. Every city the Sumerians ever built was constructed on top of a previous one. This is not metaphor, it is stratigraphy. The physical layering of occupation debris, architectural remains, ash deposits, and accumulated sediment that archaeologists call a tell, the Arabic word for the artificial hills that mark ancient settlement sites across the Near East. When you stand on one of these hills today and look at the cross-section exposed by excavation, you are looking at time made visible in compressed vertical form, a metre of occupation, then a destruction layer, then another metre of occupation, then another destruction layer. Yet each phase of building resting on the ruins of what preceded it, the new bricks incorporating the ash of the old fires, the new foundations sunk into the floors of temples that had already been abandoned for centuries before the current city's builders were born. The Sumerians did not need an abstract theory of cyclical time. They lived inside physical evidence of it, pressed into the ground beneath their feet at every moment of every day they spent building anything. When those builders excavated foundations for new temples, they found older temples underneath, sometimes containing tablets in scripts they could barely read, evidence of predecessors whose existence they acknowledged, whose names they could sometimes partially decipher, but whose full knowledge was mostly inaccessible. The scribes of the third dynasty of Ur, working around 2100 BCE, encountered objects from early dynastic periods that were already 8 centuries old. The scribes of the Neo-Babylonian period encountered Sumerian texts from another 1,000 years before their own time. Each layer of civilization was doing the same thing, building on ruins, recovering fragments, and wondering how much had been irretrievably lost in the gap between what they were finding and what had clearly once existed. The anxiety about discontinuity, about the possibility that a reset might be so complete that nothing survived to see the next cycle runs through Sumerian and Babylonian literature, with a persistence that suggests it was not a theoretical concern but an observed pattern, generating genuine fear. The Epic of Gilgamesh encodes this anxiety in its most famous scene, not as statement but as subtext. When Gilgamesh returns from his failed quest for immortality, having lost the plant of rejuvenation to a serpent, having failed the test of wakefulness that Utnapishtim set him, having exhausted every available avenue toward permanent individual survival, he does not arrive at philosophical acceptance in any simple sense. He shows his companion Enkidu's ghost, or perhaps Urshanabi, the ferryman, the walls of Uruk. He points to their construction, their brick quality, their dimensions. The gesture is usually read as a consolation. Although he cannot live forever, his works endure. But the subtext is considerably more complicated because Gilgamesh knows what the audience knows, that Uruk will fall, that the walls he is pointing to will become rubble, that the city he built will become a tell on which someone else will build something else. The walls are not permanent. The comfort they offer is the comfort of relative duration, not genuine permanence. And what Gilgamesh actually does to ensure something survives is not point at the walls. It is inscribe his story on tablets and deposit them in the city's foundations where they might outlast the city itself. The real bid for continuity is the clay, not the stone. This is a culture that understood preservation as a technical problem requiring specific solutions, and that understood those solutions as only partially reliable. The Sumerians sealed texts in clay envelopes, embedded them in foundation deposits, copied them repeatedly across different archive locations, and treated the maintenance of scribal tradition as a sacred obligation that carried consequences if neglected. At least 16 copies of the Sumerian King List have been identified across different sites spanning nearly 1,000 years, not because the document was particularly beloved as literature, but because it was understood as information that must not be allowed to have only one surviving copy. The redundancy was intentional. The scribes knew what happened to cities and what happened to archives when cities fell, and they distributed their most important records accordingly. And here is where a pattern recurrence surfaces that the documentation reading finds difficult to ignore. The same culture that documented the flood as a civilizational reset, and that preserved its knowledge against the next reset, with deliberate redundancy, also documented the individual cycle of descent and return with procedural precision. Both activities reflect the same underlying assumption that what currently exists will be destroyed, that something can and should be preserved through the destruction, and that the pattern will resume on the other side of the catastrophe at a reduced but functional level. What gets reduced in each reset is specified in the texts, with a particularity that suggests observation rather than invention. It is not merely population size or geographic range that diminishes after a major reset. It is the parameters of existence itself, the reign lengths that shorten the permeability between divine and human realms, that solidifies the conditions that once allowed for longer individual persistence that become unavailable after the flood sweeps over. Each iteration of the cycle produces a world that is recognizably continuous with the previous one, but operating under tighter constraints with less room for the kinds of existence that the antediluvian section of the King List records as having once been possible. The scribes noted this progression without explaining its cause, the way a physician might note a patient's declining vital signs without yet having a theory for why the decline is occurring, recording the data because the data matters regardless of whether the mechanism is understood. Gilgamesh went looking for the man who survived the flood specifically because he wanted to know how to escape the cycle, how to achieve the permanent existence that Utnapishtim had been granted as a singular exception that the gods had explicitly decided would not be extended to anyone else. What Utnapishtim tells him is in effect that the exception is not available. The cycle continues. Even the survivor's immortality is a kind of marginalization rather than a genuine escape. He was placed at the mouth of the rivers, far from everything, in a permanent state of removal from the world he had preserved himself to rejoin. The preservation came at the cost of participation. And Gilgamesh, returning to Uruk with nothing except the story of his failure, chose participation, inscribed his experience on clay, and placed it in the foundations of a city he knew would eventually become a tell, trusting that something would survive the next layer of destruction to find it. Whether that trust was justified and in what form it was eventually honoured is something the excavated record itself has an answer to, an answer that says something quietly significant about what the cycle does and does not preserve. The same wheel at every scale. 21 years of Venus. That is what the tablet series known as the Amisaduqa observations preserves, a continuous record of the planet's appearances and disappearances above the eastern and western horizons, maintained across more than 2 decades by Babylonian astronomers working in the tradition that the Sumerians established, tracking with disciplined regularity the precise number of days between each helical rising and setting each disappearance below the horizon and each return to visibility. The series is remarkable not because it contains observations that a modern telescope would confirm, which it does, but because of what its existence implies about the relationship between patience repetition and the kind of knowledge that only becomes visible when you have watched the same thing happen enough times to see that it always happens the same way. The astronomers who maintained this record were not curious about Venus in the way a casual observer might be curious. They were systematically documenting a cycle, its duration, its phases, its precise timing, because they understood that cycles once documented with sufficient precision become predictable, and that predictability is a form of power that accumulates only through long and careful watching. The same scribal culture that produced the Venus observations also produced the descent of Inanna, the Dumuzi, laments the King List, and the flood narratives. These were not separate departments working in isolation from each other. They were activities conducted by overlapping communities of trained scribes who moved between astronomical observation ritual, calendar, management, mythological text preservation, and administrative record-keeping as aspects of a single integrated intellectual practice. The boundary we draw between science and religion, between empirical observation and sacred narrative, was not a boundary they recognized or enforced. To the Babylonian scribal tradition, the movement of Venus across the horizon and the movement of Dumuzi through the gates of Gur were both instances of the same fundamental phenomenon, a being descending from visibility into darkness, remaining absent for a specified period and then returning to visibility on a schedule that once you had watched it enough times, you could predict with confidence. The planet disappeared for approximately 8 days during the inferior conjunction, before reappearing in the eastern sky as morning star. Dumuzi spent 6 months below the horizon of the living world before the ritual calendar announced his return. The scales were different. The structure was identical. This is not a metaphor the Sumerians drew for poetic purposes. It is a structural observation they documented in parallel texts maintained by the same institutions. The ziggurat, the most architecturally ambitious expression of Mesopotamian religious culture, was built with 7 levels that corresponded simultaneously to the 7 gates of the underworld, the 7 classical planets visible to the naked eye, and the 7 stages of the divine hierarchy from earth to heaven. The building was a cosmological diagram made inhabitable, a physical model of the nested structure the Sumerians believed governed all existence from the movement of planetary bodies at the outermost scale down through the administration of the afterlife at the intermediate scale, and into the individual human cycle of birth and death at the innermost. The 7-level form was not chosen because 7 was a symbolically appealing number, and the architects wanted their buildings to feel sacred. It was chosen because the structure the building was encoding was genuinely 7-tiered, and this building was meant to reflect that structure accurately. Form following, not aesthetic preference, but cosmological observation. And here, the pattern recurrent surfaces in its most architecturally legible form. The same count appears in the planetary system visible overhead in the underworld structure, documented in the descent texts and in the building that mediates between them, yet standing at the centre of the city, its 7 levels visible from any direction, encoding in baked brick what the tablets encoded in cuneiform. The daily solar cycle in this framework is the most frequently repeating instance of the pattern. The sun descends below the western horizon each evening and traverses the underworld during the dark hours, moving through a realm that the Sumerian texts describe as sharing geography with Kur, before emerging again in the east at dawn. This is not a metaphor for death and resurrection. In the Sumerian cosmological system, it is the actual daily death and resurrection of the sun, a being undergoing every 24 hours the same descent and return that Inanna underwent once in the narrative, and that Dumuzi undergoes annually, and that human giddim undergo across timescales the texts measure in longer units. The same structure, the same direction, the same requirement of passage through darkness before return to light repeated at the smallest available temporal scale, demonstrating in the most visible possible way that the pattern is not exceptional. It is the default mode of existence for everything that exists within the system. Nothing that enters darkness fails to return. Nothing that descends stays down permanently. The sun comes back every morning as proof of the principle reliable enough to be staked upon, consistent enough to be built into the foundations of a cosmology that then applied the same logic outward to every other scale. Monthly, the moon disappears for 3 days during its dark phase before returning as a thin crescent. The 3-day period is not incidental to the broader framework it maps precisely onto the 3 days that Inanna hangs dead in the underworld before revival becomes possible, onto the 3-day waiting period she arranged with Ninshuba in advance, onto the 3 days that appear across the flood narratives as critical transition markers. The moon's monthly 3-day absence may have been for the Sumerian astronomical tradition the most regularly observable instance of the transformation period, a phenomenon visible to anyone who watched the sky with enough consistency to notice the gap, demonstrating at a scale accessible to ordinary perception that the 3-day window between disappearance and return was not a mythological invention, but a cosmological constant, the minimum duration for a transition between states confirmed monthly above the heads of everyone in Mesopotamia who looked up at the right time. What the Sumerians appear to have been doing across all of these parallel documentation streams is mapping a single pattern at multiple frequencies and describing the relationships between those frequencies with the same precision they brought to each one individually. The daily solar cycle, the monthly lunar cycle, the annual Dumuzi cycle, the civilizational flood cycle, the cosmic kingship descent cycle. These are nested instances of the same structure, each one a different expression of a mechanism that operates regardless of scale, that produces descent and return at every level of observation, that does not appear to have an exception or an exclusion written into its operating logic. And if it does not have an exception, then the question the pattern poses about human individual existence is not whether the mechanism applies, but only at what temporal scale the human instance of descent and return operates decades, centuries, something longer, and whether the boundary between iterations is as complete as the ordinary experience of a single life suggests, or whether under the right conditions something leaks through. What those conditions might be, and what the texts most directly associated with the preservation of knowledge across catastrophic thresholds suggest about how to navigate them, brings us to the place where everything the Sumerians documented either coheres into a single picture or dissolves back into the beautiful complexity of a civilization that observed the world more carefully than any that came before it, and pressed what it saw into clay and hoped. What the clay preserves. The last thing the Sumerians did as a civilization was copy their texts. This is not a poetic observation. It is a material fact recoverable from the archaeological record. In the final decades before the major Sumerian city-states were absorbed into larger imperial structures, before the language itself ceased to be spoken as a living tongue, and became instead a scholarly medium preserved by specialists who learned it, the way later centuries would learn Latin as the language of an older authority rather than a current one. The scribal schools continued producing copies. The descent narratives were recopied. The King List was recopied. The flood accounts were recopied. The lament cycles for Dumuzi were recopied. The procedures for managing the giddim, for navigating the 7 gates, for calculating the timing of descent and return were recopied and placed in foundation deposits and archive stores and sealed clay envelopes that were designed to outlast the buildings around them. The civilization was ending and the scribes knew it, and their response was to write more carefully, to copy more completely, to ensure that whatever came next would have access to what they had documented, if whatever came next could find it, and if whatever came next could read it. Some of it was found. The tablets that have been discussed across these chapters were excavated across a period spanning roughly the mid-19th century to the present, recovered from the ruins of cities whose names survived in the texts themselves. Nippur, Uruk, Ur-Larza, Nineveh. Sometimes by trained archaeologists working within established methodological frameworks, sometimes by local diggers whose finds entered private collections before reaching institutional archives, sometimes in fragments so small that decades of comparative scholarship were required before the pieces could be assembled into something coherent enough to read. The British Museum, the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, the Ashmolean in Oxford, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum's university collections across Europe and North America between them, these institutions hold the material remains of a civilization's attempt to preserve its most important knowledge across a threshold it could see approaching and could not stop. The preservation succeeded in the narrow sense the clay survived. It succeeded partially in the broader sense enough survived to be read enough was eventually decoded to make the pattern visible. And it failed in the sense that the civilization itself did not survive, that the living tradition of understanding these texts from the inside, knowing not just what they said, but what they meant to people who lived within the framework they described, was broken for over 2,000 years and has never been fully restored. What was recovered is fragments. Coherent fragments, carefully documented fragments. Fragments that fit together with a precision that suggests the underlying pattern is real rather than assembled from pieces that happen to resemble each other, but fragments nonetheless. No single tablet says everything. No single archive preserved the complete system. What the surviving record offers is enough to see the shape of what the Sumerians understood, enough to trace the outline of the framework they were documenting, enough to ask the questions the framework raises, without being able to answer them with the confidence that the scribes who originally pressed these observations into cured clay may have felt. And maybe that incompleteness is appropriate. A system that the texts themselves describe as operating beneath ordinary awareness, that strips memory at each threshold, that returns each iteration of consciousness to the world. Without the accumulated knowledge of previous passages, such a system would naturally leave precisely this kind of fragmentary record. Enough to suggest the pattern, not enough to confirm it. Just enough to make the question refuse to close. The tablet K162 is still in its archival housing beneath the British Museum at 18 degrees Celsius in the dark. The prism WB444 is still in its display case in Oxford, its 4 sides still wrapping the King List around a column that has no obvious beginning and no obvious end. The fragment from Nippur describing a dead man at a gate trying to pass through without the required token is still in the Penn Museum. Still damaged, still only partially legible, its resolution still lost to whatever destroyed the lower portion of the clay before it reached us. These objects are not going anywhere. They will outlast the institutions that hold them, in all likelihood the way they outlasted the civilization that made them. The clay does not require our belief in order to persist. It simply persists the way the pattern the Sumerians documented persists, whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not the current civilization has the vocabularies to read what is pressed into its surface. What remains after 12 chapters of following these traces through museum storage rooms and archaeological sites and the margins for texts that were already ancient when the very most recent copies were made is not a conclusion. The Sumerians did not offer one. and it would be a distortion of what they actually documented to manufacture one on their behalf. What remains is the pattern itself, the descent and the return, the 7 thresholds and the 3 days, the giddim that persists and the cycle that does not appear to end, held open as a question that the clay poses and the clay does not answer, waiting with the particular patience of something that has already survived longer than anyone who first asked it. Outside the knee is beginning to lighten in the east that daily demonstration of the principle the Sumerians documented at every scale. The same direction it has always come from, the same threshold it crosses each morning, returning from wherever it went. We have followed the traces as far as they go. What you do with the place they lead to is yours to determine in whatever quiet remains. The climate control beneath the British Museum hums at exactly 18 degrees Celsius. It has been humming for years, maintaining the precise temperature that keeps ancient clay from contracting and expanding, from developing the microscopic fractures that would, across enough cycles of warming and cooling, eventually reduce even the most carefully preserved tablet to powder. Catalogue number K162 rests in its archival housing, in that controlled dark, the wedge-shaped marks, still sharp, still casting their small shadows when light is brought close. 7 columns. The same 7 columns they have always been. Whatever they describe was already old when the scribe pressed them into wet clay around 1750 BCE, and whatever they describe, if it is real, was already operating before the tablet existed to record it, and continues operating now that the tablet no longer needs to be read for the mechanism to function. The clay is not the system. The clay is only what someone left behind when they wanted the pattern to survive them. That distinction between the record and the thing being recorded is perhaps the most useful place to rest at the end of an evening like this one. We have moved through the King List's impossible reigns and their systematic decline. We have followed Inanna through 7 gates and counted 3 days in darkness. We have sat with the giddim in its documented persistence, with the substitute king in his documented death, with the flood in its documented reset and diminished resumption. We have watched the same structure appear at the scale of a day, a month, a year, a civilization, a cosmos, and none of it resolves into certainty because the clay was never designed to provide certainty. It was designed to preserve a question, to keep the question alive across the span of time between the people who first asked it and whoever might eventually be ready to hold it without needing it to close. History is sediment. What reaches us from any distance is the compressed residue of experience that was once as immediate and uncertain as your own people, who woke in the morning not knowing how much of what they believed was accurate, who built things they hoped would last, who pressed their best observations into whatever medium was most likely to survive them, and who were still in the end subject to the same thresholds they documented with such care. The Sumerian scribes did not escape the 7 gates by writing about them. Gilgamesh did not achieve permanence by inscribing his story on tablets. The woman buried at with the Dumuzi lament beside her, descended into the same darkness the lament described, carrying the words with her into a silence from which no clarification has returned. Memory is always a fragment of something larger that did not fully survive the crossing. What we hold of any ancient thing is the portion that made it through, not the whole. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps a third fragment is the appropriate form for knowledge of this kind, not because completeness is impossible, but because a question held open does something that a question answered cannot. It keeps the space available. It leaves room for the possibility that the pattern is real and equal, room for the possibility that it is the most elaborate and internally consistent story that human observation has ever assembled from the evidence that loss and time have permitted to remain. Both possibilities can be present simultaneously in the quiet at the end of a long listening. Neither one requires the other to disappear. There is something in the record at the very edge of what the texts preserve that stays. Some researchers note it without emphasis and move on. The tablet at the gate, the name removed from the list of the dead after a certain interval. The father at the threshold trying to pass through, lacking only the token that would grant him forward movement. Where he was going, the fragment does not say, only that the gate was there and that he was trying. Rest now, traveller, the questions you have carried through this evening do not require answers before sleep. They are old questions, older than the tablets that first pressed them into form, older than the civilization that thought carefully enough to write them down. They have survived every reset so far, They will be here when you return patient as clay holding their shape in the dark. Let your body find the position it knows. Let the details of the day soften at their edges the way cuneiform softens in low light, until the individual marks dissolve into texture and only the general impression of something carefully made remains. The pattern, if it exists, does not need your vigilance to continue. The wheel turns whether you are watching or not, and the sun, which the Sumerians watched descend into the underworld every evening and trusted it would return every morning, is somewhere below your horizon right now, mid-passage moving through whatever darkness exists between the setting and the rising. It has done this before, it will do this again, so may you move through the night ahead with that same quiet certainty downward into rest and in time back toward the light.